Core 2 students. This is the first part of a two-part presentation on identifying sources. After you watch this presentation, you'll be ready to take a short quiz on Blackboard. More importantly, you'll be able to think more critically about the sources you're using as you research your place in Mount Vernon. At its core, all academic research is about working to understand some phenomenon in the world and to explain that understanding to a community of thinkers. In order to understand world phenomena, we need to think about evidence, the traces that the phenomenon leaves in the written and scientific world. Ideally, researchers get as close as they can to the phenomenon they're studying. For example, historians look at documents written by people in the past. Astronomers use telescopes to bring the universe closer to their eye. Therefore, the first way of categorizing sources is by their proximity to the topic being studied. In other words, we can understand sources by how close they are to the topic. The language we use for this proximity is primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Primary sources are the closest to the topic. Tertiary sources are the furthest away. And secondary sources are right in the middle. Primary sources are the closest source to the topic being studied. They are the real-world record of the data, such as the texts, objects, or data that researchers analyze and interpret. Scholars often focus on analyzing, describing, or explaining their data because their work centers on how they interpret that data. In this class, we've encountered a number of primary sources. For example, Frederick Douglass's narrative of his life. Your sites are primary sources for your project. They are the data. Those places are the data that you're trying to interpret and understand. All scholars focus on some body of primary sources. For example, art historians study works of art. Scientists study empirical data. Historians study historical letters. We also constantly create primary sources of our own lives. Every social media post you write is leaving a trace of your life for someone else to understand. Future historians are gonna love social media. The next closest sources to the topic being studied are secondary sources, where primary sources record an event. Secondary sources interpret the event. Secondary sources compile and interpret primary sources to make an argument or present an analysis. Most of what we've read for this class has been secondary sources. For example, Peter Levy's chapter on the 1968 uprisings in Baltimore used a bunch of different primary sources, newspaper reports, court records, etc., to argue that the uprisings were a political reaction to systemic inequality. He read the primary sources and wrote an article about his interpretation, his argument about those sources. Therefore, his article is a secondary source, an interpretation of the event. Not only historians write secondary sources. Most scholarly articles, regardless of discipline, are secondary sources. If you read a chemist's article about an experiment on noble gases, that article would be a secondary source. Their records, notes, or data from their experiments would be the primary source. Also, secondary sources are not just for academics. Nonfiction books, magazine articles, and news analyses are all secondary sources. They're presenting their interpretation of the events, or the primary sources. The furthest source from the topic being studied are tertiary sources. They are interpretations of interpretations. You probably have been shown a lot of tertiary sources in your schooling because textbooks are an example of tertiary sources. They synthesize secondary sources to give an overview of a topic and the debates within it. They're not necessarily unbiased. They often make cases for what's most important in a topic. Tertiary sources are most useful when you want to get an overview or some basic understanding of a topic. An example from this class would be the lectures that we've given on the history of Baltimore. So here's an example of a source similar to what you may have found while Googling your site. It's a review of Antero Piattilla's book, The Ghosts of Johns Hopkins. Remember him? He wrote Johnsy's Baltimore. So, is this article for Baltimore Magazine a primary source, a secondary source, or a tertiary source? Actually, it depends on how you use it and what questions you try to answer with it. Piattilla's book is itself a secondary source, and this is a review of it, so it's a tertiary source, right? This article is an interpretation of Piattilla's interpretation of the primary sources. But could it be a secondary source? Maybe. What if you were reading reviews of Piattilla's book just to get a sense of the book itself? Then the book is the primary source and the review is the secondary source. Maybe we could even make a case that this is a primary source. What if you were doing research on how Baltimore Magazine portrays local authors? Then this review could be a primary source to understanding that. The point is this: primary, secondary, tertiary is a tool for thinking critically about evidence. How close are your sources to the event or the topic you're studying? Are you doing original research or depending on others' interpretations? Do you want to get an overview or really get into the nitty-gritty? In your project, you'll be combining primary sources with secondary or tertiary sources. Your place is a primary source. It's the thing that you're studying. It's the thing you're trying to understand. Now, most of you can't go to your place anymore, so you're having to rely on web research to reintroduce yourself to your place. In that case, maybe you found web sources that count as primary sources. For example, if your place has its own website, you might consider that a primary source about the site. As we do more research, you may find newspaper articles that offer a glimpse of your place, a historical account or a snapshot in time. That might also be primary sources. We're going to augment those primary sources with secondary sources. Some of the websites you've found may be secondary sources, interpretations of your site, such as the site's existing Wikipedia page. Some newspaper sources will serve as secondary sources. Remember the article about the Edgar Allan Poe house that we read? It was a secondary source. It looked at the historical record about the house and provided an interpretation. Importantly, scholarly sources, which you're required to find and summarize two of, will help you put your place into a larger context, and those are secondary sources. So part 2 of this presentation will take a closer look at secondary sources and categorize them as scholarly or non-scholarly. We'll also look at journalism sources, and then we'll analyze a few sources about segregation in Baltimore so that we could really understand this stuff. Before you start part 2, go to Blackboard and do the quiz on primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Then I bet you can't wait to listen to me talk more about kinds of sources in part 2 of this presentation. Thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.